The clash of shields fades. The ground is slick with blood, the air thick with smoke. You can still hear the last dying screams echo between the hills, and then silence. For the warriors who fell, their suffering is over. But for the wives waiting behind the walls, for the daughters hiding in shattered homes, the nightmare is only beginning. We remember Vikings as warriors, explorers, legends carved into sagas. But the stories rarely tell us what happened after victory, when the longships were full and the villages burned behind them. When a Viking warband conquered a settlement, they didn't just take silver or weapons. They took people, especially women. For the defeated men's wives, the end of battle wasn't relief. It was a new kind of captivity. If the fallen warrior had a family, his wife became part of the victor's spoils, sometimes absorbed into the new household, sometimes taken as a concubine, sometimes sold in markets far from home. The Norse law codes had a term for her, kona einast, an owned woman, property that breathed. Historians describe this as part of Viking social order. But for the women themselves, it was worse than death. So what really happened when the axes fell silent? How were these women treated? And why did Viking culture, so proud of honor and strength, allow such cruelty to flourish? To answer that, we must go back to the 9th century, when the Viking fleets turned their hunger from silver to flesh. The year 845, the monastery of Clonmacnoise fell to a fleet under the warlord Thorgils. 40 monks died defending their altar, but the chronicler stops writing after that. He doesn't mention what became of the women. The truth lay buried in the mud of Dublin's Wood Quay, the Viking slave market. Archaeologists uncovered iron shackles small enough for women's wrists, rings for children's ankles, drainage pits that once held human waste. This wasn't a trading post. It was a processing center for human lives. Captured wives were catalogued like livestock. 20 silver coins for a young woman, 15 for a mother, 10 if she was injured during the raid. Runic carvings in Schleswig record these prices, carved into stone like receipts. Some women were sold across the North Sea to Norse colonies. Others, the most valuable, were shipped down the Russian rivers toward the Islamic markets, the routes that led to Baghdad. The Viking ships carried furs, amber, and people. In these markets, fair-skinned Celtic and Saxon women fetched the highest price. Traders described them as exotic prizes, luxury items, but being sold, that was the merciful fate, because those who weren't sold often became the personal property of their captors, forced into marriages where the law itself sanctioned their violation. The Viking law codes were explicit. A warrior who killed a man could claim his wife within 3 days. If another warrior challenged that claim, they would fight, not for love, but for ownership. For the women, there was no trial, no choice. They were claimed before witnesses like land or cattle. Their children were considered legitimate, their suffering legal. The Norse saw the world in terms of strength. To be conquered was to be claimed. A defeated warrior's wife was an extension of his defeat. Her body was tribute, proof of victory. In Iceland's Gragas law code, the process was detailed with chilling precision. A man could announce his claim to a captive woman publicly in front of witnesses. She had no voice in the matter. If she resisted or tried to flee, she could be beaten. The law protected her captor, not her. If she took her own life, her family had to pay compensation to the man who owned her. Her suicide was considered the destruction of another man's property. To the Viking mind, this wasn't cruelty. It was order. A society built on conquest needed rules for ownership, even ownership of people. But the sagas, even with all their heroism and gods, whisper the truth in silence. They never tell us what it meant to live through that law. Archaeology does. In Ireland, near Portmarnock, 23 female skeletons were unearthed from bog soil, all showing signs of torture before death. These weren't warriors, they were wives and daughters, executed after capture. Their injuries formed patterns: skull fractures from behind, defensive wounds on forearms, broken ribs from prolonged assault. Carbon dating placed their deaths within days of the Viking raid that destroyed their village. The pattern repeated across settlements from York to the Orkneys. Women taken alive, used, then killed. The Vikings called it justice by conquest. We'd call it annihilation disguised as honor. In 921, the Arab chronicler Ibn Fadlan travelled along the Volga River and witnessed a Viking funeral. He described what no saga dared record. When a chieftain died, his possessions were burned with him. Weapons, horses, and one of his women. The chosen girl was dressed in fine clothes and given strong drink laced with henbane, a hallucinogen. The witnesses said she smiled. They thought she was willing, but the drugs had taken her will. When the funeral ship was lit, she was held down, raped by her master's men one final time, and then stabbed through the ribs before the fire consumed her. Archaeologists later found bones that told the same story. Female skeletons buried beside high-status warriors, showing marks of strangulation and poison. These weren't wives honored in death, they were sacrifices. It wasn't superstition, it was belief. To a Viking, a great man needed companions in life. His woman's life was simply part of his wealth, burned to follow him. Across Scandinavia, layers of ash and bone reveal the same pattern: ritualized killing of women in funerary rites. It was law, faith, and horror combined. Even in death, the wives of warriors had no escape. The year was 907. The Great Army wintered at Thetford in England. Chronicles mention cattle stolen, churches burned. The usual, they do not mention the infants. But the ground does. Excavations in the waste pits of Viking camps uncovered dozens of tiny skeletons, all infants, all killed by blunt force to the skull. These weren't stillbirths. They were erased evidence. The children born from forced unions, the offspring of rape, had no place in Viking society. If the mother was a slave, the child was a slave. If the child was too small to work, it died. The method was efficient, practiced, almost industrial. The Domesday Book, written centuries later, still shows the aftermath. Entire villages missing women and children from their population records, exactly along known Viking settlement routes. Mass graves tell the rest. In Repton, the Viking winter camp of 873 held nearly 250 skeletons. Only 63 were women. The rest, missing. Some were sold, some were killed, none were free. For Viking women who bore children in captivity, motherhood was a sentence, not a sanctuary. By the mid-9th century, the Viking economy had changed. Silver alone was no longer enough. The trade that truly enriched the Norse world was human flesh. Dublin, York, Hedeby, and Kaupang all had permanent infrastructure for human trafficking. Warehouses built with drainage systems for hundreds of captives. Each dock built wider than the last. Each ship designed to hold more human cargo. Arabic merchants wrote of Rus traders arriving in Baghdad with blonde-haired slaves, selling them for small fortunes. Those traders were Vikings. Their routes stretched from Ireland to Kiev. 1,000 miles of chained humanity. A typical vessel carried 20 women, bound and gagged, locked below deck beside barrels of fur and amber. Those who survived the journey would never see home again. To the Vikings, this was commerce. To the victims, it was obliteration. And yet, in the quiet corners of history, there were flickers of resistance. One name survives: Gunhild, a freed Norse captive who turned against her own kind. Frankish chronicles describe her leading raids on Viking camps, freeing slaves, burning their markets to the ground. Her war lasted 7 years. She destroyed 12 camps and executed 47 traders, the same way they had killed others. Then her name vanished. No grave, no saga, just silence. The kind that history keeps for inconvenient heroes. The Viking legacy didn't die with their last kings, it evolved. Centuries the sagas stayed silent about what the Vikings did to the wives of the defeated. But the soil doesn't lie, the bones don't lie, and the silence of the chronicles only tells us how much there was to hide. The Vikings built empires on conquest, but their true legacy was written in the suffering of those they conquered, and for the wives of the fallen, death was never the worst fate.